All right, it is the Gateway API meeting for June 13, 2022. We've got a few things on the agenda today, but before we get into all of that, just as always, this is a Kubernetes community meeting, which means we follow the same code of conduct that exists elsewhere throughout Kubernetes community. It also means that you're very welcome to add things to the agenda. Please feel welcome to talk, to ask questions, to provide feedback. I want everyone to feel welcome. And it's been a while since we've said this, but if there's anyone new to the call that hasn't had a chance to introduce themselves, anyone that hasn't introduced themselves and is interested, we'd love to hear from you. No pressure if not, though.
Hey, I think so. I'm joining this call for the first time. So
Cool.
My name is Sneha. I actually work at Microsoft, and we're definitely interested in looking at the gateway APIs. So we currently have a solution called AGIC out in the market for our Azure cloud providers. And it's ingress-based right now, like the ingress APIs. So we're definitely looking at like gateway APIs and if that's something we should invest our efforts into in the near future.
That's awesome. It'd be great to have some additional feedback. Obviously I represent a cloud provider. Lewin on the call has also been involved in this discussion too. So great to have more involvement, and really as you're going through the API or as you see things here, really appreciate your feedback throughout. And welcome. Yeah. Anyone else?
And I joined after a long time, so hello everyone.
Welcome back, Harry.
Yeah, I haven't seen you for a while.
Juggling upstream and your employer,
Yeah.
Yep, we've all been there.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that's great. Great to have new people and some people returning. With that, let me jump right into the agenda. I'm not sure who added this. I have some guesses, but I think we've all had various discussions around the appropriate status code here. It is almost hilarious how much time we've spent on determining which of these numbers is appropriate, which of these status codes. I went through and added this RFC information, but I know someone other than me added this agenda item first, so maybe they have additional context if they're on the call. Anyone? All right. Well,
I think actually, sorry, it has been a while since last week. I think I added this at Meha's request to talk about like what we're supposed to be doing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's my sorry.
That's all good. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context. It just happened that last week I was able to schedule some time last minute with Tim. I want these to be a more regular one. I want to have more SIGNet API reviewers involved. We have some people out of office that are other SIG network API reviewers. So Tim is basically the last person on the hook. And it's notoriously hard to schedule something where everyone's available. But this has led me to a broader themed idea of, if we could get to a kind of standard release sequence where, we know every 4 months, let's say we're cutting a release, then we can schedule time with these API reviewers months out and block off this block of time on their calendars where we can all meet and discuss, this release candidate and any little thing. So I want this process to be better. But with that said, this is the feedback that I got from Tim as we were going through these status codes as far as which made sense. And for anyone who isn't following, we've gone back and forth, like, I don't know. We started as a 503 as a way to represent when traffic is reaching a gateway and there's a route that matches the request, but that route is supposed to forward traffic to a service, and that service does not exist or cannot be resolved for some reason, right? So it's that Kubernetes reference is invalid for some reason.
There's an associated case that we also have that is that the Kubernetes reference is valid, but there are no valid endpoints.
Yeah.
They're two extremely similar, but at the same time different enough that we have discussed having different codes for them, use cases.
Yeah. Yeah. And at least for the first of those cases, and actually I can't remember what we've settled on for the second, but I know what I discussed with Tim last week was that to him, the thing that made the most sense was a 502 bad gateway. We spent some time going through the RFC. He seems to have it memorized at this point. I still actually have to refer back to it, but I went through. I think the status codes that make the most sense. At first we had 503, then we went to 404 because did not find a current representation for the target resource seemed to make sense. But then I think it was Mike had some concerns about that. Hopefully I'm not getting the names wrong here.
It was me.
Okay. And now Tim's guidance here is, maybe bad gateway is the appropriate thing. Service unavailable did not sound right to him. He was also okay with the idea of something more generic, just 500, right? This is just an internal server error. Don't need to be more descriptive than that. 502 felt slightly more accurate, although the 404 description feels relevant. It's in the wrong class in that it's a client error instead of a server error, which all came back to 502. So without wasting too much time on this, does 502 make sense to the group of people on this call? Does anyone have a different preference?
Last one from me.
Okay.
I think we have to be clear that, the 502 is very specifically when the gateway did not get a good response from the servers. And so, to me, that's typically where, this request has been sent off and it's not, the response has not come or it's been invalid.
I think.
Okay, so I think that the relevant thing here is like we're going to be whatever we do here, it's going to be not 100% correct because the spec doesn't really like the exact codes don't really mean like there's no exact thing that means hey, this is going through a proxy and the proxy can't get to the back end like for some reason. Like it, I think the first case that Rob talked about, it's not that you made a request, it's that there's no valid request to make because you've made a mistake in your gateway API config and you have talked to a you've configured a backend that can't be found, right? Like you can't route to it and find out that it doesn't exist because you can't even find out because it's not configured. There's a configuration error in your proxy.
Yeah, and that's where I think actually a 503 is the appropriate response because it's the service isn't available. It doesn't know how to get to a service that it's being requested.
I think what throws me off of 503 is the rationale that 503 is traditionally for overload or scheduled maintenance, and neither of those seem to apply here. I would agree with. So I think all of these you could make an argument for, right? Like I get what you're saying, like service unavailable, the name is correct. And then you read the RFC reason, you're like, well, not quite. 502 bad gateway, the name is correct, but as you're pointing out, it's not, it's not like we're making an upstream request unless you call that upstream request to the Kubernetes API server. And hey, I didn't get a response from that, or I didn't get the response I wanted from that. There is no perfect translation that I can think of here. I personally, I think that 503 is often used for things that are not this, that represent that kind of maintenance window, temporary overload, those kinds of cases. So it doesn't feel quite right to me. With that said, I recognize there are flaws with bad gateway. I I've been talking a lot. Maybe anyone else have ideas here?
I think if no one feels comfortable with it, maybe we should just take the hack the mean feed path here and go with 500. Like, there's some error, there's some server side error. End of story. Like,
Yeah.
let's, rather
You mean
than
5xx or 500?
500, the actual 500 error code.
Yeah, I think I would rather, since we're going to have conformance tests around this and everything else, I would rather have a specific error code of
Yes.
500 than any 50x, because that just adds more variability between implementations.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the most important part is that we definitely have to have something that's in the 500 class. And if we can't agree on 502 or 503, then I think we should just, not waste any more time on this and call it 500 is my proposal.
I can get behind that.
Yeah, I actually think 500 is actually a pretty good choice.
It seems pretty non-controversial. It's just such a generic way of representing this. Okay, we can update the. Does anyone want to take the
I'll update the issue.
follow up? Thank you, appreciate it.
I found my issue comment. I'm dropping in Slack or in the chat. Sorry. I think the one thing I was trying to disambiguate is the case that you were specifically calling out, the attempted routing to a bad backend. From all the backends exist and are configured properly, but there's no matching route. That one we might want to keep as a 404.
Yeah, 404 for that one makes sense, even if it's not there isn't a proxy 404 equivalent. Maybe that's something we should suggest to the IETF, but whatever. But it's it is a commonly understood to be this thing isn't here response code. It's also 500. I usually say something went wrong, whereas not having no configuration is not something that went wrong. It's the expected result of not having any configuration for that.
I agree.
Yeah, agreed. I think the one where it's going to get a little tricky is the routes not accepted case, because if you go back to that comment, Rob, the one that Mike mentioned there, the routes not accepted case due to an issue like supported kinds, or for example, reference policy removed or something like that. It's going to just get. We're actually going to have to be very specific about with different error classes. We're going to have to say this one is a 404, this one is a 503 or 500, whatever. I think we might have to have some guidance in the actual implemented guidance in somewhere in the actual thing that says that actually lays out every case we can think of and what needs to happen, and then have tests to make sure that those things are actually what happened. It could be maybe the answer here is to either write a longish issue that documents the exact each use case and what happens, or a gap or something. I don't know, but it feels like we actually need to have a document that writes out here's all the places, all the things that we can think of, and here's the use cases, and if we come up with any more use cases, we'll add them to this document or this.
I've been meaning to consolidate my assorted issues into a gap or something like that. And I think from the implementation side, it's actually more straightforward than it may appear at first, because the not accepted case just means that it doesn't get programmed. So it's actually the default handling of it is the same as just a not match thing. So yeah, that's something I can try to take on now.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Yeah, because I think, and I think that if you write out here's the different things that can happen, and here's the error code that happens in those cases, then it should make everything much more clear.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, Shane, were you about to say something? Hope I didn't cut you off.
Nope.
Oh, I'm just imagining. Sorry. All right. So with that said, does my conclusion, as I've outlined in this agenda doc, make sense? If there's no matching routes, it's a 404. If there are matching routes, but the backends are either not found, they're missing, can't be routed to, it's a 500. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I think we just need to,
Yeah.
and we also need to call out the everything, all the config is valid, but there are no endpoints as another use case. I think that's probably a 500 as well, but
I think so too.
that's what I mean by writing out all of the different
Yeah.
things that happen. Will be important. So yeah.
Yeah.
Do we want to be prescriptive of the response body in these cases?
I don't know that we can.
Should
don't
we
know
be?
how-
It's kind of weird to me because like the client that receives these errors isn't going to be able to do anything with them or really care about, you know, what they happen. Like the thing that actually matters for getting it fixed is like the admin who manages the HTTP route will see like a condition on it that says like, you can't do this because it conflicts with the other thing. And you take it as corrective action. Whereas the client's like, oh, okay, it's an error message. I guess I shouldn't do that.
Yeah. I think that personally, I would say this to me rates as one of the things where practically it's probably TMI to give a client that, you know, any internal details about how the proxy works or anything like that feels risky to me to give to the client, because it's one of those things that feels like it might turn out to be really handy for attackers to enumerate exactly what is being used if we put too much information in there.
That's exactly what I was about to say. It's a lot of customers, or users in IT organizations don't want to expose that kind of information for that very reason.
Yeah, the same reason that your standard Apache configs don't include like the Apache version in the error messages.
Yeah.
Okay, great discussion. I think, Mike, you're going to follow up with a longer term description of what we should do here. And Nick, you probably already commented or updated on the tracking issue for the milestone.
I haven't yet, but I will. Yeah, I'll do that.
Cool, great, thanks. Okay, with that, let's move on. Shane, I think you're next. Your changelog changes. Thanks for adding this.
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on in here. Well, first, oh no, this is that one. Okay. So I just kind of feel like the changelog process that I just went through was a little bit tedious. So I thought that instead of having to put your changelog entries in your issue as kind of like just a blurb and then somebody has to go through and find them later, we should actually just make this a PR checklist item. Update the changelog when you have user-facing changes, and just have the changelog constantly growing with like a unreleased version that we kind of dump everything into. And then when we're ready to do a release, we can move things in or out of that, into another unreleased while we're releasing things that are actually in it or so forth. So everybody that had got on here and like responded to it seemed to think it's okay to at least try this. But I just figured I would bring it up in this meeting so other people could, if they missed this is what I'm suggesting to do, and see what other people have to say.
Yeah, I commented on there. I'm fine with it. Yeah, as I said, I think we have a slightly more involved system in Contour, but this is a good first cut. That's definitely worth trying.
We have a
One of the
similar system. Oh, sorry, Rob.
Oh no, go for it.
We have a similar system to what you're describing with the directory for Contour X for console. The issue we found with updating a single changelog file is that it frequently makes PRs stale and conflicted when you update the changelog and then one merges and then another updates it. I don't know. I haven't looked at this closely to see if that might be susceptible to this issue or not.
I mean,
Yeah,
there will probably be some conflicts right after we merge it, I would guess. But in general, the way I've seen PRs go, I mean, one goes through every couple of days. We usually put the thing on there. I think it would be, and we don't usually split our releases up very much. We usually just have everything in there when we release. So I don't necessarily predict a bunch of conflicts, but it's also one of those things where like we can try this, see if it's better, and then if we're like, no, it ends up being just kind of this mess at the end, then we can just kind of pull back on it and try a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have the directory method in our back pocket. Like I guess so which I think it's fine, and I think the only thing is like it might be slightly irritating to change twice, but I don't think it's a big enough deal to to even warrant probably more discussion than we have done now.
Yeah. I agree with everything that's been said. I am concerned about, in the past, we've had different files that ended up being points of conflict where every PR had a conflict, needed a rebase. And we took a lot of effort to avoid those and to rework our infrastructure to get rid of those points of conflict. This feels like something that could introduce that again. Because of that, I would prefer to hold off on it until after RC goes in, just so that we at least get an RC out. But with that said, I am interested in trying this out. I really appreciate all the effort you went to, Shane, to run through all those PRs and get the changes out and try and make them into something sensible. Creating a change log is not easy, especially with our current lack of tooling. So thank you. And I think this is worth trying. Like Nick has said, like others have said, we can always move back to, change item per file kind of thing in the future. So, yeah. Cool. Any additional comments? All right, keep on moving then. Shane, I think this one is you too.
Yeah, so Travis and I both have been pondering because we have two implementations of Gateway API now, and in both of those implementations, we've kind of run into the kind of interesting conundrum that the status addresses don't necessarily make sense. So the way status addresses is documented on a gateway right now is basically just all addresses IP addresses that the gateway is bound to. So in theory, I mean, you could put load balancer IPs from services, cluster IPs, pod IPs. You can put whatever you want on there. But there's kind of this problem of there's no context. So like as it stands right now, we put the load balancer IPs in our alpha implementation. We just put the load balancer IPs. We make them the first ones so that they're kind of the nice kubectl get displayed IP address. And the only usage for these addresses for us right now tends to be to just go talk to the gateway via the load balancer IP address, which is a context that we can only figure out because we're humans. So like the actual underlying API type for these addresses is just a list of strings. So like there's none of that context can kind of be programmatically determined. So if you wanted to kind of do an integration where like some piece of code wants to go talk to the address or to the gateway, it would need the context of knowing like how. It might want the context of knowing that it wants to do it over the cluster network as opposed to like the public internet, stuff like that. There's no way to do that today. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there that like it's very limited what we can do with the addresses today. We pretty much only meaningfully put the load balancer IP address on there at the moment, but we want to do potentially more. Wondering if other people had a similar or dissimilar experience. So just kind of open the floor to people's opinions here.
To actually jump in and say no. So we do the opposite of that. We get both the load balancer addresses and the cluster IP address of the service.
Sorry, you're right. We do that, but we don't do anything with the cluster, like with the non-load balancer.
Yeah, I think we put it somewhere. I forget where. And my thinking was just get rid of it because like the kind of stated purpose of Gateway is traffic going into the cluster from outside of it, and that traffic those clients obviously cannot talk to the cluster IP. It's internal. It's kind of the open question where like definitely with ingress we've also seen where like people will use ingress configured proxies for traffic that is internal to the cluster, and whether like there is any purpose to having like cluster IPs for those types of clients, or if we just kind of say like it's a bit non-standard, so if you want to do that, you just grab the service host name and use it instead.
Yeah, I think it's in my mind, it was definitely intended to be a similar behavior to the ingress and service, like load balancer address stanzas, where it's like the point of this thing is that if you programmatically want to know how to connect to this gateway, you can look at the addresses, and you should be able to connect, from the to that address from the context that the gateway is relevant for, which most of the time is going to be outside the cluster. Like you don't know about cluster internal networking internals. I mean, that's the sort of, in my mind, the definition of what a gateway is it translates from things that don't know about cluster networking internals, like cluster IP, to stuff that does.
Let me give you an example of where the context of, like, programmatically, the context of actually talking to it over the local cluster might be important. So we might have other ways to solve this, but at least currently, in one of our implementations, we have the notion of a control plane which runs separately, and being able to communicate with this data plane, with our gateway, over addresses that it finds inside of the gateway addresses, theoretically. I mean, that's kind of the suggestion of, like, a different context that might be worthwhile. And in our case, we at least potentially have a use for that. I'm not saying that's the only way that we could do it, and we could definitely, like, iterate on this, but there seems to be something there that you would want to potentially have, like, hey, I've got control plane traffic going to the gateway, as it were, and that control plane traffic probably shouldn't go over the public internet when it doesn't have to. So
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I know it would benefit a number of implementations. Like for Google Cloud, we have internal load balancers, right? And it is, although most people who are provisioning gateway class ILB basically know that, okay, this is going to give me an ILB. If you want to write something programmatically just against gateways as a whole, understanding that this is something like I have to reach a different way. This is an internal address that requires some separate way of referencing it. Maybe a more concrete example is when you're running conformance tests. It is helpful to understand that this type of address needs some kind of custom round trip or logic, like the request has to originate in some other place or some other way. Or in the case where there are multiple addresses, like I think Shane is describing here, understanding which one you can pick. Like if I know that I'm in the same network, I should pick the one that's, the same IP. I think I'm not sure how to represent this, but I think it's useful for a variety of different cases. I agree that it's basically the same thing as load balancer, service type, load balancer, or ingress addresses, but this could use some more context, I think. So I would personally love to see a gap around this.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think that, yeah, writing it up with like some issues and some sort of more detail about the exact use cases that people are thinking here would be useful. In my mind, I think I'm like there's two things that I'm thinking of. Like I understand it is good to have more context, but on the other side, I don't want the sort of the simple case that doesn't need the context, i.e. the internet facing context. Yeah, it'd be better to not have to have the context if it doesn't need it, right? Like I prefer to see this be like an optional thing that you add on somehow, rather than a thing that everybody has to do to manage to meet the case.
I think, to me, the question is, what is the purpose of including this address? So, is it so that I can know all the addresses that are affected because the status is wonky? Or is it so that I know how to reach the particular gateway that's having a problem? And those are two very different things. And even with the second one, where it's basically it's like, is it the traffic interfaces, or is it the management interface? Which could be the same, but in many cases won't be. And then if this isn't a service, but you're running this in your own Kubernetes cluster, you might have multiple instances of a gateway actually. And so you might have actually multiple IP addresses that would be quote unquote management IPs, right? So I think we just need to be clear on what the purpose of the including this address information is.
Yeah, and like Travis corrected me and I think I was the one that actually did this. We did at one point just put like the service cluster IP into this just because I think it was just kind of a misnomer. But all we've meaningfully done, the only thing that we're meaningfully doing is the load balancer IP, the public IP address. I think it might, as much as I'm just asking this to try to get feedback, and actually I appreciate all this feedback because it's good to know that everybody's kind of roughly on the same page. Like, yeah, it's a little vague. The only thing that I think really matters today is the load balancer IP, the public IP. So maybe it's just it's possible that just documenting that better and just saying, actually, this is just for publicly internet accessible IPs or something like that. I mean, something that kind of pushes people towards using it for the purpose that is most generally used right now might be okay, as opposed to like going all out and trying to add like different networking contexts that you can add to your IP addresses.
Yeah, I think that documenting it a little better is probably good. I think that we need to be careful though, because it's possible that an external to the cluster IP may not be a publicly visible IP, right? Like you might be doing like something Rob talked about as like an internal load balancer. It's internal to your network but external to the cluster, right? And that's it's the outer edge of the cluster, so you don't know about cluster networking. That's again, that's why I keep coming back to. That's why I keep using that language to talk about what a gateway is that you have stuff that is owned by you and probably uses like an RFC 1918 space, but it's not like public address, but it's still external to the cluster, right? And so I think that's the key definition, is that currently the expected behavior, which I think we have 100% not well documented, but certainly the way I expect it to be, is that any addresses that are listed in the status are the addresses that that is external to the gateway can like pull a gateway, or that you can tell clients that are external to the gateway to connect to. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
part of the thing is, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Like when I've kind of brought this up, I think just with Rob in passing like a week or so ago, and he's like, make a GEP, sounds good. And I do agree, this could be a GEP, but the difficulty is like we don't necessarily have an impetus right now to make this a GEP, because we can, for instance, like reference the service that is ultimately load balancing traffic to the gateway and like do things that way for the purposes of the one case I can think of right now, which is like the control plane traffic to the data plane. So I don't know if I'm actually going to go ahead and make a GEP on this right now. I think maybe I'll start with, based on the feedback that I've heard here, some clarification. And yes, I'll be careful about what you just said, Nick, about like, the distinctions that are made in what's supposed to actually be in there. And then maybe something else will come of it later. Because at least today, I don't know for sure that there's anything else that we would be like, there would be a lot of pressure for us to make any other change.
Yeah. I think the one thing that I would also include in that is that it feels like the Gateway API is all about defining the data path, not about the control path, and about management traffic. So I'd be pretty -1 on any of the addresses that are included in that status having anything to do with the control plane. I think if we want to do something else for control plane, we should do a separate control plane thing that is very clearly a separate control plane thing. The main use case is to describe.
That's a good thought.
Yeah, I agree with all those thoughts. I want to clarify that, I guess also agreeing on something Nick had said earlier, that when I see addresses in status, I assume that they are externally accessible. What I think could be helpful, at least the cases that interest me about this, is some kind of optional indicators, additions, some kind of indication that this address may not be externally accessible, but is accessible via this with this specific modification. Like this may be internal to your network, internal to your cluster, some other thing, some set of well-known traits. as has kind of been alluded to, this is a very similar problem in the service and ingress APIs that we have survived without any better representation of that. So it can work without any, but I'm open to a better way to represent that. Obviously, we have motivation for that. I know I've seen some implementations, maybe it's Istio, where the first thing they set in gateway status addresses is a host name for service. And then if that service is type load balancer, it switches over to the load balancer IP when it's assigned. So you could see like in that initial step, you may want to have some kind of indication, hey, this is not broadly accessible. It's limited to the cluster you're in. I think there's probably some other use cases like that, but as others have said, we've survived without this. It seems like a nice to have kind of thing. Yeah, any additional thoughts on this one? Cool, all right. Candace, thank you. Yes, June 20 is a new US holiday. I meant to add this to the agenda. Thank you for adding it. I personally have the day off, so I will not be able to make it to the meeting. Are there enough people that would like to continue to have a meeting on June 20, so a week from today? I will take that as no. But as always, you're welcome to meet without me or anyone else, but I will not be there. So I will plan on canceling unless I hear otherwise, and then we can meet again June 27. Okay, I will call that cancel. All right, next one is the 050 milestone. There's been some movement in here. Thank you to Nick for adding most of these issues. This is basically just the follow-up from Tim's feedback last week. I have addressed 2 of them. I chatted with Meha about the last one in here, the status code one. She has said that she'll get it done in the next 24 hours or less. So that's great. I think we're in a good place. I want to just run through these really quickly, the actual PRs. They're both relatively large, but I think they're non-controversial. This is, I think, the only implementation I know for sure that wants to support both reference policy and reference grant is Console, but maybe there are others as well. Either way, it's great for a better, smoother experience. So for that purpose, adding reference policy back into V050, this will mean it comes with this kind of, this is a really hard screenshot to see, but yeah, anyways, you get a deprecation warning when you use this in 050. Seems like a reasonably good experience, and you get a warning for anyone in that upgrade path. Would appreciate any reviews on this. I hope this one is pretty straightforward. And the last one is just that where we had webhook and CRD validation, this just changes it to just webhook, sorry, CRD validation. So a net removal of lines in this case. So 2 relatively small changes. Would love to get these in ASAP. I really do want to get a release candidate out, as I'm sure many of you do too. So yeah, that's what I know of in this milestone. Are there other things we should be looking at before an RC?
I really hope not. I'm tired of turning over rocks and finding more rocks underneath.
Same. Yes.
I do just want to warn other implementers about the PR that I think you merged today, Rob. That bumps the Kubernetes client libraries and introduces a couple of breaking changes due to a fork of Gnostic and a breaking change in a major version of GoLogger, I think. So that'll be fun for implementers.
All right, so we need to ensure that in the changelog we call out that there are breaking Kubernetes API changes and you need to bump your Kubernetes deps. Yeah.
Yeah. Good call. Thanks for that reminder. With that, I set aside some time tomorrow for myself to work on cutting RC1 out. I'm really hopeful that tomorrow at the same time, we'll actually be able to get RC1 out the door. With that said, I am very welcome to anyone who wants to be part of that. If you want to just sanity check what I'm doing, cutting a release is still kind of we have documentation, but we've also changed a lot since our last major release. So like this is our first time with release channels. So a second set of eyes or a third or fourth or whatever, double checking what I'm doing. Or if someone else wants to drive, I'm great with that too. But my goal is to cut a release tomorrow afternoon. If it makes it, and by tomorrow afternoon, I know everyone's in a different time zone, but I mean, the same time as now, just tomorrow, just 24 hours from now. So yes, if anyone is around, just ping me. I'll add you to the invite. If not, that's fine too. But that is my personal goal. I'm shooting for 24 hours from now, having a release out. And I would appreciate any help getting to that point. Cool.
If I am online, I'm happy to help, but there's a good chance I won't be.
Yeah, understood. Cool. All right, last on this list is Travis. Something about listener host names. What?
Yeah, so I was looking at basically, previously we kind of didn't really do listener conflicts correctly for a variety of reasons. And looking at finally implementing those properly, it seems like, if you have an existing listener, there is nothing stopping you from just changing the host name, port, or protocol to something else. That could result in a conflict, and overall it looked like the designing our listener conflict system, I've tried to make it so that the idea is that if you add a new listener that's conflicted, it doesn't, it's not random which one of those wins. If you have a previous listener that was already not conflicted and ready, it keeps going because you don't want to destroy existing listens that people are probably actually using. This one sort of makes that difference. It seems like the only way that you'd be able to track that, like if you enforce that, you have to need to say if something critical in the listener changes, so it's hostname, port, or protocol, you essentially have to treat it as new and remove that sort of precedence from it. And that seems like you'd have to maintain state, which I think generally you don't want to do in a reconciler. So I'm curious other people have had this sort of same thing with determining whether a listener is conflicted or not, and if they have strategies around handling it.
I think in Contour, we have gone backwards and forwards with discussions on this. I 100% agree that it's a bad experience to have someone change a Kubernetes object and have your config go away. But at the same time, the config has changed. The config has changed. I am kind of a bit of a purist that whatever's in Kubernetes you should do, and if it's broken, then yeah, sure, it breaks. Be careful.
Right, both of them.
Yeah, that's I think the trying to hold state in the controllers like you're talking about is so fraught with race conditions and danger and all that sort of stuff that I'd kind of say I don't think it's worth the sort of trade-off in user experience, because the big risk you run by doing that sort of thing is that you're trying to do stuff to hold the user's hand to make sure that they don't cause themselves a problem, but by doing that they might cause themselves a problem and then not know about it because they've made a breaking change and nothing's broken.
Yeah,
they'll still at least informed about it, and one of those listeners will definitely be conflicted. So they'll know that there is some conflict available, even though it's not both of them. That standpoint, I'm at least okay with it, but I can see if you make bad configuration, we'll warn you about it, and it will actually be broken.
We have also gone back and forth on this too, and we actually ended up, at least for now, taking a slightly different stance of taking long leaps and bounds to store last known good state outside of the controller, but somewhere, and trying to use that as a reference point, as a point to recover to, etc. to be determined how that works out, but it is something we're exploring. This is a tough problem. I don't know. I completely understand and get the idea that, like what Nick was saying, like we should do what the user wants. Like it in many ways, it's better to fail more quickly so that it's when a user is changing something and so they're aware of it, they're there, they can recover, as opposed to changing unexpectedly, days later, or some other thing for some other, like your controller restarts or whatever it is. This is I don't have a good answer. We're exploring something. We're exploring a different approach. I'll try and do some digging and see what we can, like there's some docs, I'll see what we can share. But high level, it's trying to store last known good state somewhere else. We don't know how well this will work yet. This is just an idea.
That one may work for us reasonably well. Like we have, unfortunately, like state that's outside the controllers already, which causes us problems, but we're not going to get rid of it anytime soon. So we could take an approach of like, if you create configuration that results in a conflict, like we just won't, even if you added like other listeners that aren't conflicted in that same set of changes, we just don't apply them until you clear all the conflicts.
Yep.
Yeah, so like one of the biggest concerns I have, one of the biggest problems we've had in Contour is that, okay, I'm going to delve into some implementation details for a sec because they are relevant. Give me a minute. So that when you're doing Envoy XDS programming, Envoy can send back a ACK or a NACK whenever you send changes. Right now, Contour doesn't handle the NACK case where you send config to Envoy and it basically says, I can't accept this for some reason. And Contour just drops that on the floor. And so it'll just keep trying to send the bad config and Envoy will see that, hey, I can't take that. Practically what that means for users is that if we generate a bad config because we take some user intent and turn it into Envoy config and send it over to Envoy, and Envoy responds back and says no, basically that means that the Envoy will silently stop accepting all changes from Contour until you figure out that there is a problem and then do something about it. And that sort of class of problem is the reason why I tend to be, you do what's in the thing, and if it causes a problem, you tell them as soon as possible. You're better off breaking people immediately when you make the change, like Rob said, than breaking them at some random time because your controller restarted or you had a data loss in your external data store or something like that. I think if you're going to do something like that, an external data source out of the controller is a necessity because of the problem that if your controller restarts for some reason, if you're holding that state and your controller restarts, and then the change will, then it'll start up, and then the config will be dropped probably because you'll read it in as net new and be like, hey, I don't have a last known good config. This config is bad. I'm going to send no config, right? Like it just means that one of the reasons that I'm so pro, just do what the user says is it makes it a very predictable thing. You change something, it immediately breaks, right? And it's very clear that it's broken.
The other option that's I guess kind of implied here, but didn't really talk about, is that these aren't immutable now. There's not a whole lot of reason we can't make them immutable, other than that, like there apparently isn't any existing Kubernetes API construct for this sort of thing. Like I know ingress class controller string is immutable, but it just kind of like in the API definition says this is immutable and doesn't do anything to indicate that. So I'm guessing it's in a admission webhook somewhere. Making these immutable would be kind of annoying in that, if you want to reconfigure kind of an existing listener, you basically have to either delete it and then recreate it, or create a copy of it with a different name and then rename that afterwards. But to Nick's point, that is kind of a good, it informs the user that something is dangerous there before it could become actually dangerous.
So I'm interested in what that means or how that would work. You're right, with ingress class, it's just validation that exists inside core code, API/validation for networking. But the same thing, we have webhook validation for gateway class controller name that enforces immutability. I really wish there was a built-in construct that did it for us. There's not, but we do have a thing in Gateway API that means immutable. With that said, for this specific concept, it feels complicated. What defines a listener? Is it the listener name? Is that kind of the thing that, so if you change name at the same time as you're changing host name, port, and protocol, is that fine because it's a net new? It's basically like you're adding a new listener and removing the old one if you're changing name. Or is listener defined by its index in the list, like just I am listener number 0? I think that would be a little hard to define. And then my other concern is, as we are nearing a beta release, once we get to that point, adding more restrictive validation is going to be near impossible, unfortunately. But if there is a compelling thing, it may be something we could look at between RC1 and, but it sounds pretty complicated. Yeah, it's probably too late. So I think it's something that we would have to work around and come up with some guidance for how to handle these changes. Yeah,
we've specifically left the exactly how the listeners work to be up to the implementations. Like we've got some guidance that hey, you can, it's acceptable to take multiple gateways that have distinct listeners and merge the gateways into like an eventual config. That's 100% fine. And we have given guidance on what happens when there is a listener conflict, but we haven't given guidance on like what constitutes a listener conflict, right? Like, I think at the moment it's expected that it's the tuple of like host name, port, protocol, and probably name. And those things need to be distinct rather than like the index or something like that. I think, I think it is, as you say, it's a very complex problem, but I think the overarching question that is very important for us to answer is how much behavior should we how much user protecting behavior should we mandate in the upstream API? Like how much should we encourage people to do that? I think that's the sort of the underlying question that underlies this and will probably underlie other issues as well. And having an answer to that question, I think, is really important. I mean, you can tell by what I've been saying. My opinion is this is software for people who should have a fair idea of what they're doing. It is at the end of the day a better overall user experience to like screw over the people who are making config changes than it is to screw over the end users and have config changes happen at random times later. So that's why I'm in favor of having the API be very sort of, whatever's in the API is correct and, is what the user intends. And if they make a mistake, well, sorry, be careful. Like that is sort of my position. But I think that's a pretty extreme position, and I would understand that other people might not be cool with that. So yeah, I think that's the question that we need to answer.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good. I think I learned all I intended to. So
this is a good discussion, and it may be worth, maybe this is a discussion item or an issue, one of those. But just I know you're not the only person running into this. Or if you haven't, others will soon. So it would be good just to have some kind of central place where we can describe what others are doing, at least. Come up with some kind of best practices.
I think a discussion item sounds really good to me, Rob.
Great. Yeah, Travis, if you want to start a discussion, that would be awesome around this. And I can comment on it. I'm sure anyone else can too.
I'll be right there.
Cool. All right. I think Nathan added this one, and unfortunately he had to leave. I missed that. We could have moved this up in the agenda. But I think this specific PR is about conformance. Yeah, I have been failing to get caught up on conformance tests. I do want to get some of these conformance test PRs in as soon as possible. I think Nathan is saying that this is ready to go and we can leave additional assertions for later. That's
Yeah, I
my
agree with that.
input.
I'll comment on there too afterwards. But I think that this one is a good example of a thing that I also wanted to talk about. I know we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to drop it. I can drop it and run. Right now we don't have any way for the conformance tests. The conformance tests are all or nothing. If you install just the standard CRDs, then you will not pass conformance because it includes tests about reference policy and reference grant, which are not in the standard CRDs. So I think we've got two things we need to solve here. Number one, we need to move reference grant to be in the standard ones as soon as possible, which I think we need to do anyway. But also we need to have some mechanism that you can specify like what resources you're being conformant for or what version you're being conformant for or something like that. We're going to need something like that as well because the current conformance test suite is for like layer 7 controllers, not for layer 4 ones. Once we start having TCP and UDP route conformance, we're going to need to have people be able to say, I'm not doing HTTP route, I'm only doing TCP route or whatever. So we're going to need that at some point as well. It just seems like maybe we
I think I added basic scaffolding like that in my initial reference policy implementation.
Okay.
TBD if it's sufficient or fine-grained enough, but there's at least something there we could start with.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, the features thing. Yes, sorry, I forgot about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that took me off guard too, because it's weird to move reference policy or grant to experimental because technically we're just moving a subset of things to stay to standard, and everything prior to that was always experimental, but it still feels weird because prior to 050, the standard set or the default set of CRDs, I gotta be careful with my wording here, the default set of CRDs we installed included reference policy. And in 050, it won't. You'll have to install experimental CRDs for that. That's going to be weird. And so, yeah, like you're saying, we need to be careful in how we document this and how we communicate it. Once we cut RC1, I want to spend a lot of time working on documentation, blog post, etc., making this approachable, because it's a big change, and as much as it could technically be a no-op for implementations of the API, it's going to require some thought and understanding for anyone trying to upgrade themselves. So yeah. Okay, yeah, I think that's all I have, and we're at time. Any last things before we call it? All right, I will see everyone in a couple weeks, and enjoy your week, and we'll talk to you soon. Hopefully after an RC. Cool. See you.